What's up everybody, it's Charles. In this video, we're going to be installing an intake on the Golf R. In addition to that, we're going to be doing some comparison of under hood and intake air temperatures with the stock intake and the aftermarket one. I'm going to place two temperature probes underneath the hood, one to monitor the air as close to where it hits the filter as possible, and one monitoring under hood temperatures. Then we're going to use our P3 gauge that we just installed to monitor intake air temperature, which is going to be pulling a temperature reading from the sensor right inside the manifold. Ultimately, that's probably one of the most important readings. Now, my guess is going to be this intake will actually raise our intake air temperatures just a tiny bit, not enough to really make a significant difference in performance. However, if you're trying to eke out every last little tenth of a horsepower, that could actually be a factor. Something else to consider where we're monitoring our intake air temperature, the air has already gone through the charge cooler. Before we change anything, let's talk a little bit about how the stock setup is. This entire section right here is an air duct. From the center to the passenger side, this is actually open to the engine compartment. Now there is a flap you can get or a block off you can get from Audi that can block this off. What that would do is instead of this air flowing straight through to the engine, it would force it through the ducting into our airbox. This side right here looks like it should come right into the air intake. However, it is blocked off completely. So once our air is in this ducting here, it goes into another duct, down to the bottom of the airbox, up through the air filter, down the tubing, and then into the turbo inlet pipe. All right, let's go ahead and undo our airbox here. See, here's our air filter. Something a lot of people will also do is replace the drop-in air filter with something like a performance air filter and remove this screen down here to allow a little bit better airflow. I think that's probably a pretty good plan, especially because this car does not use a mass airflow sensor. If it did, that may cause issues with the way the air tumbles through the intake and cause incorrect readings. For our underhood temps, we're going to be using this guy right here. This is actually an AC temperature gauge. We have two probes on it and dual readings. Looks like they read pretty darn close. So we're going to take one of our probes, and we're going to actually run it all the way through down into the airbox, and then I'll secure it to that screen on the bottom there. That way we don't pinch it in the box. And I think our other probe, we'll go ahead and secure it right here. So we're actually pretty close to where our intake air temperature sensor is reading from. All right, so I got one temperature probe right here, right by where the intake air temperature sensor is going to be reading. That's also the map sensor. We have the other one inside of the airbox, right underneath the air filter, with our wire tucked here. Let's make sure none of these wires are going to be a problem or in the way. I don't think my gauge is going to reach inside the car. Wah, wah. So what we're going to do, we're going to leave it under here. We're going to take it on a quick drive. We'll stop, we'll get out, we'll hit our test button, and we'll see which reading is which. So we are in the car. My temperature gauge in the car is reading 65 degrees. We have our intake air temperature sensor reading right here. Let's go drive it and see where we're at. All right, so after right about 4 miles, our coolant temperature is kind of where we would expect it. Our intake air temperature is reading 81 degrees Fahrenheit. We're at 64 degrees ambient temperature. Let's jump under the hood and see what it looks like under there. All right, so we have our filter reading 83.5 degrees and our engine reading 95.1 degrees. 95, 84. Let's keep going and see just how warm we get. All right, so we got about 10 miles on the car. Currently, as we sit here at idle, we have a 92 degree Fahrenheit intake air temperature. As the car sits for a couple more minutes, that'll probably go up. Let's check under the hood, see where we're at there. So we got 88.8 and 106.9. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let this heat soak for a few minutes. We'll come back and see what it is after about 5 minutes. As you can see, after the heat soak, our temperatures did climb quite a bit, including our intake air temperature. We are back at the shop. So we're gonna go ahead and put the fan on the car, let this all cool down. If it weren't for that coolant line, I would probably just go ahead and put everything on right now, but I wanna let this cool down a little bit so we're not dealing with hot coolant. While that's cooling down, let's take a look at our new intake setup. We have our conical filter here. This is sort of our filter housing. You can see there's a velocity stack where the filter mounts up. That goes into this silicone pipe. Here is our fitting for that airline for the intake manifold. This will connect to the hard pipe. Then we have another silicone hose that'll go to the turbo inlet pipe. We have our mounting bracket here. This will attach to our housing. And then this is that coolant line that we're gonna replace so that it runs underneath the intake manifold. We also have a stack of clamps that we're going to be using, a piece of foam. They even included a couple of block offs so we don't really lose any coolant while we're making the swap. All right, we're gonna start by taking the cap off the coolant bottle. Now, if your car is still boiling hot, you need to do this very, very slow so all that pressure doesn't release at once and cause a geyser of coolant. For now, I'm gonna leave this cap off, but before we do our coolant line, I'm gonna put it back on so that we don't lose as much coolant. Let's go ahead and start working on this old air box and getting it out of our way. I'm gonna undo this clamp here. We need to take our vacuum line off of this side of the air box. If you struggle to get this off, hit it with a little bit of lubricating spray and it should come right off. Loosen our T30 screws. We can lift up our box. We can pull the cover off and set this to the side. Get our air filter out of the way. Go ahead and take our temperature probe out of here. Next, let's take this ducting off up front. 2 T30 screws. Right at the back at the middle, there's a tab. We need to pull up on that tab. Then we need to slide the whole thing forward. There's 2 tabs right here that go into the ducting. So you need to undo the tab and lift it up a little bit and then slide it forward to the vehicle and then you can remove it. Next we have 2 T25 Torques that have to come out, one on the passenger side and one on the driver's side. Then we have to remove this tab. We're gonna push this top part right here back and then lift up on the tab here and we can pull it out of the way. We can pull this part of the ducting with the coolant hose attached up and out of the way. Then push down a little bit on the ducting on the end here where the tab is and it'll release. Do that for both sides. Now we can take this big ducting and get it out of the way. Look at how silly that is that it's blocked off. Well, it seems silly, but maybe there's a reason for it. Let's go ahead and take this coolant hose off of this piece of the duct. Get this out of the way. Keep this vacuum line here somewhere where you'll see it so you don't forget to hook it up. Now for the box itself, all we have to do is pull up on it, but you need to kind of grab it back at the back and towards the front. You want to pull straight up with it. There are actually 3 spots, 1, 2, 3, where it attaches to the car. Another mod that guys do is they'll remove this snow screen right here. That'll help with airflow a little bit. Next, we'll need to remove this air intake pipe. The clamp on my car was oriented a little weird, so you may have to get kind of a small 7mm socket to get back there. We are going to be reusing that clamp, so we want to make sure we're careful with it. Once it's loose, we can just go ahead and remove the pipe. We'll go ahead and take this clamp all the way off. Real quick, while we have this intake off, a mod that's actually pretty smart to do at the same time is gonna be one of these turbo inlet pipes. Pretty much out of the intake stuff, this is the piece that makes the biggest difference in actual horsepower numbers out of everything else that we're gonna replace. Great time to go ahead and do it now. I'm gonna hold off on this one. We're gonna do it in a separate video because I wanna test the stock intake and the aftermarket one pretty much exactly the same way. And I'm also kind of kicking around powder coating this or something like that. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think? Should we powder coat it or paint it yellow maybe to sort of be hidden and match the car? So we're almost ready to install our new intake. But before we do that, one more little thing. Before we install any of this new piping, I actually like to take and clean them out to make sure that there's no yuck inside of it before installing it. This is all past the air filter, so if there's any yuck in it, all that stuff could go into our turbocharger, and we don't want that. All right, let's start with our first silicone piece that goes into the turbo inlet pipe. This is a tapered piece. There's a bigger side and a smaller side. If you're using the factory inlet pipe, the bigger side goes to the new intake, the smaller side goes to the inlet pipe. If you have an aftermarket inlet pipe, this is probably going to be the same diameter all the way around. Let's go ahead and get this installed. We take our clamp that we took off of the original pipe. Go ahead and set that on. Clock this in a way that you can actually get to it and tighten it. Go ahead and set that on. I'm not going to tighten anything till I have everything installed on the car. Next, we'll get our hard pipe. We can clean that out. Our intake kit comes with technically 4 clamps. One's already on the air filter. We have 2 smaller ones and 1 bigger one. We're gonna take one of the 2 smaller ones and put it on the silicone pipe. We'll take our hard metal pipe. We have the curved down piece. That's gonna go into our silicone hose. Now, before I get any of the air box back on, let's go ahead and do this coolant hose because we have plenty of room. Before you take any of those clamps off, take your coolant bottle cap and install it. This will help not lose so much coolant. Make sure it's all the way on. Click. There we go. Start by getting our engine cover out of the way. We have 2 clamps, one that goes to this hard coolant line here and one at the plastic flange at the radiator. Take our hose clamp pliers, undo 1 clamp. If you have an absorbent mat, this may be a good idea to use one so you don't get coolant all over your engine compartment. Slide the clamp off and slide the little stopper right back on. That way you don't lose too much coolant. Then we're gonna do the same thing for the other side. When you're working on the plastic side that goes into the radiator, you gotta be insanely careful. These are the type of connections that when the car's got some miles on it, if you look at it wrong, you're gonna end up breaking it. Here is our new hose. We have this real sharp curved end and sort of a flatter end. This hook end right here goes on the radiator side. We're gonna go ahead and put our clamp on. Make sure that we orient it in a way that makes us happy. This side I definitely want down and facing this way. Carefully slip your cap off, slide the hose on, then do the same thing for the other side. I like to do the radiator side first because I feel like I'm gonna lose less coolant doing it that way. Once you have it on, go ahead and snug your clamps up. All right, so here's what our new coolant line looks like. As you can see, it's gonna run right along the top of the radiator shroud rather than up and over the intake. Next up, we actually have to install a bracket on our intake box. Here's our bracket here. You'll notice there's 2 holes here at the bottom. That's how our bracket needs to go. There's a small tab on the bracket that needs to face down. Now, in looking at this and installing it really the only way that it can install, because it can't go that way, it can only go this way, can't go this way, can't go this way because of our tab, I'm noticing that it looks like these rubber pieces are probably on upside down. IE does have a pretty good online instruction that shows them not installed at all, so I'm just gonna flip them around here. That's how every other one of these style of push down things has went on every VW ever made, unless I'm wrong. So it should look more like that. Now what we'll do is we'll take our screws. These are 4mm Allens. Come up from the top through to the bottom. Go ahead and put our locking nut on. Do the same thing for the other side. These are semi-decorative, so we want these to be facing up when it's installed in the car. Nuts. Tighten these down. The bolt part is a 4mm Allen. And the nut is a 10mm nut. Probably don't need to go to town all crazy on these guys. Whenever I'm dealing with these rubber grommets like this that hold stuff in, they can get kind of sticky over time. I usually take a tiny bit of dielectric grease, which this thing is like the coolest container ever for dielectric grease. Just a little bit, lubricate them. That should help removal and install a little bit later on if we need to, which I'm sure at some point we will. One final piece, we have this little block of foam that we need to install, and that's just gonna go right here. This is the piece between the intake and the radiator. Put it on like we care what we're doing. There we go. That's pretty good. Give it a pushy push. You can install your air filter now if you want. I think I'm gonna wait till we have it on the car to do it. All right, so clearly this giant open space is where our intake is gonna go. This is a super easy install. The rubber grommets on the bracket we just installed clip here and here. So go ahead and make sure you don't have anything in the way. And we just set it down on there, line it up, and push it in. Notice that our coolant line goes right underneath our new intake, which is much more better than just flopped up over the top. Go ahead and get our filter on next. Notice this has the IE logo on it right there. So depending on how OCD you are about this, you may want to orient it in a certain way. I'm gonna orient this one just like this. I'm also gonna tuck the screw down for the clamp underneath so that you don't really see it, which means I get to have a goofy way of installing it here. Check our orientation. Yeah, that's pretty good. We got one more pipe to put on this reducer pipe that's sort of bent shaped. Before you do that, put your big clamp on the big side, which is the side that goes near the air filter. Smaller side goes into the metal pipe. The little vacuum line here, remember, goes to our intake manifold. That's going to face down so you don't see it while it's in the car. I really appreciate that. We have everything loose, so we kind of just rock it into place. You may need to clock it and move it a little bit to make sure that it fits properly on each portion of the pipe, and you're not rubbing any of the wiring harness or the coolant lines or the high pressure fuel pump. All right, once you have everything all lined up, making sure that there's no rubbing or anything like that, it's time to go ahead and tighten our clamps down. If you want to be OCD about it, be OCD about it. If you don't care, well, that's cool too. Once you got that last clamp clamped down good and snug, give your intake a good shake, make sure it's not hitting anything. We'll need to go ahead and put our vacuum line on down here at the bottom. So we have our intake in, everything's pretty happy where it's installed. Let's go ahead and get our temperature probe hooked on here. I think this is gonna be our spot right here for this temperature probe. Go ahead and zip tie this guy on here. And of course, before we go on the drive, double check your coolant level and make sure it is still full. You're not gonna lose a lot, but we need to double check it to be sure. All right, so I am stopped at the exact same spot that I was before. It is about 10 degrees warmer than it was this morning. Coolant temp's pretty much the same. Our intake air temperature sensor is at 100 degrees. We should chalk some of that up to the air temperature being a bit warmer. Let's see what we got under the hood. I can already tell you the intake is much louder than it was before. So we have our probe here. We have our other probe there. So here's our readings at pretty much the same test drive. It's interesting, this isn't too far off of what our gauge read. And as we sit here, that'll heat soak a little bit even more. Let's go ahead and take it on that next test drive and see where we end up. All right, same test drive route as last time. Here's our coolant temperature. Ambient temperature is 75 degrees, so we are a bit warmer, and we do have higher intake temperature readings. Remember, this is the sensor on top of the intake manifold. Let's see where we're at under the hood. So there we have it. This compared to what our stock intake read. Let's get the thermal camera out and see what it sees. Let's go ahead and shut the car off, let it heat soak just like we did last time, so we can try and get an accurate comparison. All right, it's been a handful of minutes. Let's see where we are at under the hood here. All right, our temperatures have evened out, which is interesting because I don't think that's how it was before, but keep in mind, it is 10 degrees warmer than it was when we did the other intake test. That's probably playing a factor in it. 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Ooh, doggy, look at that intake air temp, 135 degrees. Seems like, anyway, a significant increase in under hood and intake air temperatures. So we got our test drives done. Before we talk about those numbers, let's listen to what the difference in sound is from the stock intake versus the aftermarket one. So I was actually blown away by how much louder the aftermarket intake really is, especially under load while driving, which is kind of hard to capture the noise because there's so much other engine noise and air noise going on. You hear everything from the air being sucked in, you're hearing the diverter valve more, you're hearing more turbo noises. So that aftermarket intake is considerably louder. Now, let's look at our numbers. We're gonna start with the stock intake at the first stop. Now, we had an ambient air temperature of about 65 degrees. On the stock airbox, we had an intake air temperature reading in the gauge of 81 degrees Fahrenheit. Our probe in the filter read 83.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and our engine probe read 94.3 degrees Fahrenheit. That compared to our aftermarket setup with an ambient temperature of 75 degrees, our intake air temperature sensor in the gauge read 99 degrees Fahrenheit, Our filter probe read 93 degrees Fahrenheit, and our engine read 115.1 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, stop number 2, still about 65 degrees Fahrenheit on our stock setup. We had an intake air temperature reading of 92 degrees, a filter reading of 88.8 degrees, and an engine reading of about 106 degrees. For our aftermarket intake, we had an ambient temperature of 75 degrees. Our intake air temperature read 107 on the gauge. Our filter temperature probe read 92.8, and our engine temperature probe read 120.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the final test was after the heat soak. Our stock intake air temperature sensor reading was 116, our filter probe was 101.9, and our engine probe was 131. For the aftermarket one, we had an intake air temperature reading in the sensor of 135 degrees, a filter reading of 132.8 degrees, and an engine reading of 132.8 degrees. I am actually surprised that our temperature readings climbed that high during this test. I thought it would be a couple of degrees, and maybe if you factored the percentage of ambient temperature difference, which was about 10 degrees, you might come to the conclusion that it really is only a few degrees. Where it's interesting is actually how much on heat soak that airbox does insulate the air filter and the air intake coming in. Now, when we compare full throttle, giving it all she's got, the max on the gauge that I saw in the car for both of them was about 107 degrees. So does that mean that under wide open throttle, we're really not seeing that much of a difference in intake air temperature between the aftermarket and the stock one? Does that mean that our charge cooler is doing about the same job, even though perhaps the air coming in is a bit warmer? Doesn't mean that none of this even matters, and if you want to put an intake on your car, put an intake on your car. Well, those are all really good questions, and we want to follow that up with, okay, that's fine and good, it changes our intake air temperatures, but what does that do to horsepower? Now, when we're talking about a car modified like mine is, basically nothing other than software, simply installing an intake is not going to be that monumental power gain like something a tune would do for you. It's going to be minor. Where we see the bigger improvements on something like an intake is after we've got all the other mods on, downpipe, charge cooler, stage 2 software, turbo inlet pipe. That's where we'll see the big increase in power. So you're wondering, Charles, why didn't you take it to dyno and see what kind of power you got? Great question. And the reason is for what I just said. I want to wait till we got full stage 2, everything else is done. I'm going to take it to the dyno. We're going to see what it does with this intake. I'm going to put the stock box back on it and see what we get on the stock box, which should be interesting because that's where I think we're going to see the big difference. Maybe, I don't really know. That's where I think, though, we're going to see the big difference. Otherwise, we're talking, if I had to guess, a couple of horsepower, maybe. Did notice, though, that the throttle was a little bit snappier, which I liked. And definitely if you like turbo noises and you want to hear the car more, that's not a little speaker mounted underneath the cowl, well, this could be a great upgrade for you. So there we go. If you are doing full stage 2 build, intake's probably on your list. If you want more turbo noises, definitely that's a way to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Questions or comments, you know what to do. If you like the video, hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.